Have you ever stopped to think how often a simple presence can be seen as a threat? He was there, standing in front of a cafe, waiting for a friend, looking absently at his cell phone. But to her, this was suspicious. The woman was frowning, watching him as if something was wrong. His eyes glanced at the well-aligned clothes, the calm manner, but none of that mattered. For her, he simply didn't belong there. Without hesitation, she picked up the phone and dialed. "There is a man here. He looks dangerous." Her voice was filled with false concern, as if she already knew exactly what to say to be taken seriously. "He's been out of action for a while. It may be waiting to do something." The police dispatcher on the other end of the line doesn't question it. He just responds, "We are sending a vehicle." He did not hear the complaint. He only noticed when some of the looks around him started to become different. People coming in and out of the cafe looked at him with a hint of hesitation. Some quickened their pace, others just looked away. But he already knew what was happening. He had seen this before, and yet, he remained where he was. Then the sound of sirens cut through the air. The car approached quickly. The woman crossed her arms, satisfied, believing that she had fulfilled her role. But what she didn't know was that, this time, things wouldn't be as she imagined. And now I ask you, have you ever seen something like this happen? If so, tell me in the comments, because what happens next will surprise you. Before we dive into this exciting story, I want to know, where are you watching from? Right here in the comments. It's incredible to see how far stories like this can go. And don't forget to leave your like. This helps a lot so that more people know this powerful message. Subscribe to the channel to continue following impactful stories that need to be told. The sound of sirens cut through the air, and the vehicle stopped abruptly in front of the establishment. Two police officers got out of the car in a quick and rehearsed movement, their hands already positioned on their belts, ready to act. There were no questions. There was not even a moment to try to understand the situation. They looked directly at the black man and approached him. "Hands where I can see them," ordered one of the police officers, his voice firm and full of authority. The other approached cautiously, as if he were dealing with a dangerous suspect. The woman who made the complaint watched the scene with a satisfied look, her arms crossed, feeling that she had finally fulfilled her civic duty. His smile was subtle, but filled with pride. For her, that was the natural outcome of things. The police were there to protect her, to ensure that this man did not pose a threat to the neighborhood. She didn't bother to question whether he had actually done something wrong. She didn't need proof. The simple fact that he was there was enough for her to see him as guilty. The black man remained still, his eyes calm but attentive. He already knew that script. I had seen this story repeated countless times, with different characters, but always with the same outcome. He took a deep breath and maintained his posture. Any sudden movement could be misinterpreted. Any wrong word could cost you dearly. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, his voice controlled, with no sign of desperation. But the police didn't even consider responding. Identity. Now, he slowly moved his hands to his jacket pocket, but the simple gesture made one of the officers reach for his holster, ready to react. The tension in the air was visible. The audience that had previously passed by distractedly began to stop. Some people discreetly walked away, not wanting to get involved, while others recorded the scene with their cell phones. Everyone already knew how these situations usually ended. The woman turned to the officers, pointing her finger at the man. "He was here a long time ago," standing still, looking around. He didn't seem to be expecting anyone. "It's not normal." The police officers nodded, as if that were a plausible justification for an aggressive approach. "Did someone call you to this place?" asked one of them, completely ignoring the prejudiced tone of the complaint. The man raised his eyebrows, his expression serene. "Do I need permission to be here?" The tone of his voice was neutral, but it carried an uncomfortable truth. The officers looked at each other for a brief second, but the woman intervened before they could respond. "You're not going to let him leave like that, are you? At least check if he has a police record." She spoke with conviction, as if she were about to solve a huge problem for society, as if he was doing the community a favor. The officer who appeared to be in charge pulled out his radio. "Center, background check appointment." The man took a deep breath. I knew that, no matter how absurd that situation was, I would still need to go through it. Even so, he would have to prove that he wasn't a criminal, that he wasn't there to cause problems. The cycle repeated itself, as always. But this time, something would be different. While one of the police officers waited for the headquarters to respond, the other approached even closer, examining him from head to toe. "So, what are you doing here?" The man kept his eyes fixed on him. "Maybe the right question is, why do you think I shouldn't be here?" The police officer frowned, uncomfortable with the answer. The woman snorted, rolling her eyes. "Look at his tone. Are you really going to let him talk to the police like that?" The policeman straightened up. "We ask questions here, and I suggest you cooperate." The man smiled, but without humor. "I'm cooperating." It was at that moment that the radio screeched. The response from the center arrived. The officer holding the device looked at the screen, and his expression changed within seconds. He blinked a few times, as if he needed to make sure he was reading it right. He looked up at the man in front of him and then, for the first time in that approach, he hesitated. The other officer noticed his colleague's reaction and leaned over to see the information on the radio screen. The silence that followed was heavy. The woman realized something was wrong. "What is it?" he asked impatiently. "Does he have a criminal record?" The police officer, who had seemed so confident before, now stuttered a little before responding. He is... The black man took a step forward, taking his time. He already knew what was written on that screen. The woman's eyes widened. "What it was? Say it soon." The man slowly raised his hand and pulled a golden badge from his pocket, shiny in the sunlight. He held it tight in front of the police, who now seemed completely lost. "I'm the new head of the station." The impact was immediate. The woman took a step back, her mouth opening but finding no words. The IEU police officers looked at each other, pale. All the arrogant posturing disappeared in the blink of an eye. The game had turned. The man closed his wallet and looked up at the two agents. "Now I want to know, what is the justification for this approach?" The silence was absolute. Nobody expected that. "And now I want to hear from you. If it had been an ordinary black man, without a badge, would the outcome have been the same? Tell me here in the comments. The truth has come out. If you think the racist woman deserved this lesson, or how many times has this happened? It is believed that this type of injustice still happens every day. I want to see your opinion." The officers kept their hands close to their weapons. The tension in the air was palpable. The woman, still with her arms crossed, showed a slight smile of satisfaction. For her, everything was going as it should. The police arrived, acted quickly, and were now about to remove that suspicious element from their precious neighborhood. What could go wrong? The black man maintained his firm stance, but the police officers didn't even seem to see that. For them, he was already guilty. They didn't need to hear his version. They didn't need to ask anything. All I had to do was act. "Hands on your head," ordered the first police officer, his voice firm and with no room for questioning. The man took a deep breath. He knew exactly what was coming next. If he obeyed, he would be treated as someone who should be removed. From there, if you questioned it, it would be considered disrespectful. And if she reacted even in the slightest, she knew she could end up becoming a statistic. He slowly raised his hands, keeping his expression calm. "Officer, I believe there is a mistake. I said hands on your head." The second police officer approached, already holding the handcuffs. The man remained calm. "If you would just let me explain." But the policeman was already behind him. In one swift movement, he grabbed her wrists tightly and snapped the cold cuffs around her wrists. The metallic click echoed in the silence of the room. The woman watched the scene with pride. She truly believed she had just prevented a crime. The first officer lightly pushed the man by the shoulders, forcing him to step forward. "Now let's go to the police car." It was at that moment that the man smiled. Not a smile of humor, but a smile filled with something that no one there expected. He slowly turned his head to the police officer holding him and said, his voice firm but without raising his tone, "Believe me, you will deeply regret doing this." The police officers looked at each other, confused. The woman frowned. "What's it like?" The man straightened up, still handcuffed. He looked directly at the two officers. "If you had done the minimum amount of investigation before treating me like a criminal, you would know exactly who you were dealing with." The first policeman crossed his arms. "Oh yeah? And who do you think you are?" The man took a deep breath and smiled again. He already knew what came next. The police held him firmly, pushing him towards the police car. The metal of the handcuffs tightened his wrists, but he showed no reaction. His breathing remained calm. His gaze remained fixed, analyzing every detail around him. He knew that, for those officers, it was just another case closed before it even started. The woman who had made the complaint watched the scene with an air of satisfaction. For her, this was proof that she was right, that her intuition protecting the neighborhood was justified. But then, the man stopped walking. He didn't resist. He didn't try to escape, just stopped. The police officers looked at each other in surprise. "I told you to keep walking," said one of them, shaking his arm. The man raised his face, maintaining a half smile, as if he knew something that the others didn't. "Officer, are you sure you want to go through with this?" The tone of his voice changed. It was no longer a passive tone, nor that of someone trying to explain themselves. Now it was a tone of authority. The silence in the room became heavy. The people watching the scene began to feel that something was about to happen. The woman frowned. "What kind of question is that? What are you insinuating?" The police hesitated. For the first time, they really looked at him, trying to understand why he was so calm, so confident, even though he was handcuffed. It was then that he took a deep breath and spoke. "I would like to get my ID card." The first policeman laughed derisively. "Ah, now do you want to identify yourself? I should have done this sooner." The man tilted his head slightly to the side. "You never asked." The cops froze. They hadn't actually asked for his identification. They went straight for the aggressive approach, assuming he had no right to be there. The officer cleared his throat, trying to maintain an authoritative tone. "Very good. Take your ID slowly." The man nodded. With a controlled movement, he slid his hand into his jacket pocket and pulled out a leather wallet. He opened it slowly and raised his arm so they could see. What the police officers saw made their faces lose color. The badge shined in the sunlight. It was no ordinary document. It wasn't any identification. Era the police chief badge. The silence was absolute. The tension in the street turned into pure shock. The woman who moments before felt in control of the situation took a step back, her eyes wide. The police officers remained motionless. What was once confidence and superiority was now fear and confusion. The man slightly raised an eyebrow and smiled. "Now can we talk properly?" Time seemed to have stopped. The golden glow of the badge reflected the sunlight, highlighting the truth that no one expected. The man handcuffed in front of the police, treated like a criminal without even being heard. He was the new head of the police station. The revelation fell like a bomb. The weight of that moment was crushing. The police officers who until a few seconds ago had been in control of the situation froze. The first officer's eyes widened as he read the name on the document. The second man's breathing became heavy, and his trembling hand slowly moved away from the gun holster. They both exchanged quick glances, each looking for an answer that didn't exist in the other. They knew they had made a serious mistake. The woman, who until then had been watching the scene with a satisfied look, suddenly lost all color in her face. His expression went from arrogance to a mix of shock and fear. She took a step back, her mouth opening and closing a few times, unable to form a coherent sentence. The police chief, still with his wrists in handcuffs, maintained a firm stance. His gaze was now unwavering, and his tone carried a weight that made every word echo in the consciousness of those present. "What now, officers?" His question cut through the silence like a "ow" blade. The police were slow to react. The first finally found his voice but stuttered as he tried to speak. Sir, we didn't know." The boss tilted his head slightly, analyzing them. "You didn't know because you didn't bother to ask. They just assumed." The woman tried to intervene, her voice shaking. I only called the police because I thought it was weird. I couldn't have known that." She stopped speaking mid-sentence, realizing that any justification at that moment would sound ridiculous. The audience that had previously watched in silence now murmured among themselves. People held cell phones, some discreetly filming. History was being recorded, and soon the world would know what happened there. The second officer finally reacted, rushing forward to remove the handcuffs. "Sir, I'm sorry. It was a misunderstanding." The police chief didn't move a muscle as the handcuffs were unlocked. He rubbed his wrists slowly, feeling the metallic mark left by the aggressive approach. He already knew that that moment would become a symbol. The officers were now motionless, waiting to see what his next move would be. The woman tried to blend into the crowd, but it was too late. Everyone knew who she was. Everyone had seen what happened. The chief stepped forward and looked the officers directly in the eyes. Answer me one thing. If I wasn't who I am, how would this story have ended? The silence that followed was deafening. None of them dared to respond. Now I want to know your opinion. If he didn't have the badge, would the outcome be the same? Write in the comments. This happens every day if you believe that this injustice is repeated frequently. Or, this time justice won, if you think this story can serve as a lesson. I want to see your opinion. Silence still hung over the place, but it was no longer the silence of a trial being made without evidence. Now it was silence, fear, embarrassment, guilt. The police officers who minutes ago were firm, authoritarian and impassive, now seemed small, insecure, desperately looking for a way to get out of the situation without causing even greater damage. The first officer tried to compose himself, smoothing his uniform, as if that could erase everything that had just happened. His voice, previously firm and full of authority, now sounded shaky. Sir, we didn't know it was you." The police chief raised an eyebrow. The sentence was all he needed to expose the naked truth of that approach. If they had known who he was, they would have acted differently. If they had known his position, they would have asked before handcuffing him. They would have given him the benefit of the doubt, the right to speak. But he shouldn't need to be the chief of police to be treated with respect. He crossed his arms, analyzing the posture of the two men in front of him. "And tell me, what exactly did you think I was?" The police officers looked at each other, not knowing how to respond. The second officer swallowed hard and attempted a wry smile. "It was a misunderstanding, sir. We just follow protocol." The police chief slightly tilted his head. "Protocol? Does your protocol say you must handcuff a person before even asking their name?" The question remained in the air. The first officer opened his mouth to respond, but realized that anything he said would only make his situation worse. The woman, who until then had been trying to move away discreetly, found herself trapped. Everyone was still, looking at her. She had been the spark for that fire. He knew that his action was now being observed by dozens of cell phones recording everything. She finally decided to speak, trying to smooth over the situation. "I only called the police because I thought it was strange that he was standing here for so long. I couldn't imagine it was a police officer." The police chief turned to her slowly. His gaze made her retreat a little more. "And what exactly seemed strange?" She stuttered. "Well, you were there, doing nothing, and is that a crime?" She blinked several times as if searching for an answer, but nothing she said would change the facts. She hadn't called the police because she saw someone commit a crime. She called because he was there. The police realized that the attention was now on her and took the opportunity to remain silent, hoping that the weight of the situation would fall on the woman and not on them. But it was too late for that. The station chief had already seen everything he needed to see. He took a deep breath and looked directly at the two police officers. "Do you realize what you did here today? Do you know what this approach means for all the people who go through this and don't have a camera recording, a job title to protect them, a badge to justify their existence?" The first officer didn't know where to put his hands. He ran his fingers over his belt, then the radio on his shoulder, but he couldn't find a safe place to lean. "Sir, that was not our intention." The boss narrowed his eyes. "But that's exactly what you did." The second police officer tried to justify himself. "We only responded to a call. The report said that a suspicious man had been standing there for a long time." He let out a short, humorless laugh. "Then tell me, if it had been a well-dressed white man standing in front of you, would you have come running the way you did?" Once again, the police were unable to respond. The police chief took a deep breath. "I didn't expect special treatment. I didn't expect you to recognize me. But I hoped they would at least do the basics, ask questions before judging." The cell phones continued recording. People around were murmuring among themselves. The story was already being spread, and the police knew it. It wouldn't take long for his images to circulate on social media, exposing what had just happened. The police chief turned to the first officer. "Your name?" The officer blinked a few times in surprise. "I'm Officer Martin, sir." The boss nodded and looked at the other. "And you?" "Officer Roberts, sir." He crossed his arms. "So, Officers Martin and Roberts, tell me, if it had been another black man, with no badge, no title, no witnesses, how would this story have ended?" None of them had the courage to respond. The woman, who had previously displayed an air of superiority, now seemed like a smaller version of herself. His rigid, confident posture was gone, replaced by an obvious tension. She tried to maintain her composure, but her restless eyes and rapid breathing gave her away. The weight of the gazes on her was overwhelming. That same audience that previously saw her as a concerned citizen now saw her for who she really was. Someone who used the police as a weapon against a black man who had done absolutely nothing. She opened her mouth, searching for words that would free her from that situation. "Look, I was just worried about the safety of the neighborhood." Her voice shook at the end of the sentence, and it irritated her. He took a deep breath and tried again. "I didn't want to cause any problems, but you have to understand, you were just standing there for so long, doing nothing. I just thought it was weird." The station chief crossed his arms. He had heard excuses like that before. It wasn't a real explanation. It was just an attempt to mask the obvious racism that had motivated this absurd accusation. The woman felt the need to reinforce her defense. "I did what anyone would do. If someone had been standing there watching the movement, anyone would have been worried." He tilted his head slightly, without looking away. The way he looked at her made her feel growing discomfort, as if she were being taken apart, as if everything she said was being analyzed with a magnifying glass. Then he asked the question she least expected. "What exactly looked suspicious about me?" The silence was immediate, one of those heavy silences, full of tension. The woman blinked a few times, not knowing how to respond. She knew what she wanted to say, but she couldn't say it out loud. The boss kept his expression impassive. "I was standing still, waiting for a friend. No aggressive approach, no strange behavior. What exactly made you think I was a danger?" The woman looked around, looking for support, but found only serious faces and accusing looks. Some people held cell phones, recording every detail. That scene no longer belonged just to the moment. It would be seen by thousands, perhaps millions, in a matter of hours. She felt a lump in her throat. Panic was beginning to rise within her. I don't know. I just felt like something was wrong." "Did you feel it?" repeated the boss, raising an eyebrow. "Or did you see something that warranted calling the police?" The woman hesitated. "It was an instinct, an intuition." He let out a short, humorless laugh. "Instinct." His voice carried a weight that made the words sound ridiculous. "Your instinct told you that a black man, standing in the street, was a threat." She swallowed hard. The police officers next to her said nothing. They knew they had followed through on an unfounded complaint, and worse, they had exposed their own structural racism by acting without question. Now there was no easy way out for anyone. The boss sighed, as if he was tired of having to explain something that should be obvious. "The problem was not your concern. The problem is what made you worry." He took a step closer and looked at her closely. "If it had been a white man in my position, well-dressed, looking at his cell phone, would you have called the police?" She blinked several times, feeling her face burn. He knew the answer, but he couldn't say it, because admitting the truth at that moment would be assuming to the world that that whole situation only happened because she didn't accept the presence of a black man there. The tension in the air increased. The audience watched in silence, but everyone had already reached the same conclusion. There was no justification for what she did. The boss took a deep breath. "Do you know what the problem is? This type of complaint happens all the time. Black men approached for no reason. Black people being treated like criminals before they are even heard. And all this because someone had an instinct." The woman crossed her arms in a last attempt to defend herself. "And now? Am I the villain of the story?" He kept his gaze steady. "You are not a story villain. You are a reflection of a much larger problem." Her discomfort was evident. The police remained silent, waiting to see what the next move would be. The station chief looked around, seeing the attentive faces of the audience, noticing the silent revolution taking place there. People were rethinking everything they had normalized up to that point. "Now I want to know your opinion. Do you think this woman should be legally liable for making a false report? Comment here. Racist. Accusations must be punished. If you think there should be consequences, or did she learn her lesson? It is believed that this situation was enough for her to never do that again. I want to see your comment." The head of the police station was still there, firm, without looking away. The woman, who until a few minutes ago felt in control of the situation, was now barely able to stand. His body was shaking slightly, and his hands, previously safe and authoritative, as he held his cell phone too. Call the police were now restless, trying to find a place to hide, but there was nowhere to run. She was surrounded by accusing gazes, cell phones recording every second and, even worse, by her own conscience, which at that point already knew that he had made a mistake that could not be erased. The chief sighed and slowly turned to the two officers who still maintained a rigid posture, although they were visibly uncomfortable. "Officers, take note of what happened. I want a full report on this. Approach, including the name and statement of the woman who made the complaint." The police hesitated. The first cleared his throat, glancing at the woman, as if waiting for her to react, but she couldn't say anything. The second officer finally nodded, pulling out a notebook and starting to write. "Full name, ma'am?" The woman's eyes widened, as if she only now understood what was happening. She shook her head, raising her hands. "That's not necessary. It was just a misunderstanding." The boss raised an eyebrow. "Isn't it necessary?" He laughed, but without humor. "So, when the complaint was against me, it was an urgent case. But now that you have to answer for it, is it just a misunderstanding?" She looked around, as if expecting someone to come to her defense, but the same people who had previously seemed just spectators were now against her. She realized that no one there saw her attitude as justifiable, and that made her even more desperate. The first officer looked at his boss. "Sir, what exactly should we report?" He kept his gaze fixed on the woman. "Report that there was a call for a suspicious occurrence, without evidence of a crime, without a legitimate reason to approach, and that the complainant provided information without a concrete basis, leading to a case of police embarrassment and abuse." The woman felt a lump in her throat. "Police abuse? I just made a report." The boss tilted his head. "And you know what happens to black people when they are the target of unfounded complaints, don't you?" She opened her mouth but quickly closed it. I knew exactly what he was talking about. Cases that ended tragically due to unfounded suspicions. People who lost their lives because someone thought they were in the wrong place. She took another step back. "I didn't know that was going to happen." The boss laughed softly. "I didn't know, or have you ever cared to think about the consequences?" The woman looked at the police officers, as if trying to find some way out. "You don't need to write anything down. Please, this doesn't need to be taken any further." The second officer looked at his boss, waiting for his decision. The boss crossed his arms. "Now, doesn't it need to be carried forward? Now that the situation has turned against you? But when I was the target, you were ready to handcuff me without even asking my name." She started to cry. "I'm not racist. I was just scared, I swear." He watched her for a few seconds, then took a deep breath. You know what the problem is? It's just that no one thinks they're racist until they're confronted with their own actions." The first policeman, still embarrassed, cleared his throat. "Sir, do you want us to take this forward as a formal complaint?" The boss kept his eyes fixed on the woman. She was red, curled up, begging for it to go away. But the truth is that she never imagined that she would be forced to answer for her own actions. The story that started as just another case of everyday racism quickly turned into something much bigger. Cell phone cameras recorded everything. From the moment the woman made the unfounded complaint until the revelation that the man she thought was suspicious was, in fact, the new head of the police station. Within hours, the videos were circulating on social media. Her face was everywhere. At first, the woman tried to ignore the impact. He thought that, like so many other stories, this one would soon be forgotten. But what she didn't expect was how strongly the public would react. The video was shared by thousands of outraged people who pointed out how his behavior was a reflection of a much larger structural problem. The case gained space in the media, being debated on TV shows, podcasts, and even in international newspapers. It was then that the first real consequences came. The company where she worked was tagged several times on social media. People asked if this was the type of employee who represented the institution's values. Within a few days, the answer came in the form of an official statement. She had been fired. Shock took over her. Now she was the target. Now she was the one being judged for her actions. He tried to defend himself, saying that he wasn't racist, that it was all just a misunderstanding. But no one bought that version. The images were clear. The tone of voice on the call, the satisfaction on the face when seeing the police approach a black man for no reason. None of this was a misunderstanding. On social media, the criticism was merciless. Comments like, "This happens every day, but this time it was filmed," and Her privilege ended the moment the truth came out, showed that the public would not soon forget. People recalled other similar cases, discussed the impact of racial reporting, and demanded more severe punishments for situations like this. While the woman saw her reputation crumble, the police chief became a symbol of resistance, his calm in the face of injustice, his firm stance in exposing police officers and his handling of structural racism were praised everywhere. He received interview invitations, was called to lectures on discrimination and leadership, and his name became synonymous with justice. But he wasn't carried away by sudden fame. In one of his statements, he made it clear, "This story is not about me. It's about how many people go through this and don't have a badge to protect them." Now, I want to know your opinion. Do you think this woman learned her lesson, or will she still try to victimize herself? Comment here. She reaped what she sowed, if you believe that she is simply suffering the consequences of her actions, or justice needs to go further, if you think this case should serve as an example for greater changes. I want to see what you think. The repercussion of the case did not stop. The video of the unfair approach, the surprising revelation, and the racist woman's reaction continued to spread, being shared, debated, and analyzed by thousands of people. But in the end, the question that remained was just one. What if this man didn't have a badge? Because this time, the story had a twist. This time, the black man unfairly approached had power, status, a position of authority. This time, he was able to safely expose the injustice, transform the narrative, and walk away with his head held high. But what about those times when the victim is not a police chief, and when the only thing a black person has to defend themselves is their own word? This is the reality for thousands of people. Men and women who are judged before they even open their mouths, who are seen as suspects just for existing. And, unlike what happened in this case, many don't have a camera filming. They don't have witnesses around. They don't have a chance to turn the tide. How many stories like this happen and are never told? How many times does an unfounded complaint ruin someone's life? How many innocent people have been humiliated, arrested, or even lost their lives because of a simple, "He looked suspicious"? This story went viral, and the racist woman felt the weight of the consequences. But the truth is that this happens every day in different places, with different people. And most of the time, nobody sees it, nobody reports it, nobody does anything. And now I want to hear from you. Have you ever witnessed something like this? Comment here. This happens all the time. If you believe that this story reflects the reality of many people, or justice needs to be for everyone, if you think this case should serve as an example for greater changes, and if you want to continue following stories that need to be told, subscribe to the channel right now. If you got this far, comment, "I watched until the end," so I know that you followed this complete journey. And don't forget to leave your like, because it helps spread that message even further. Now, click on the next video that appears on your screen, and continue this conversation with me. See you there.